Hi, I'm Nicola Hands, and I'm going to read my translation of a piece by Manuel Aristimuño, who is a Venezuelan author. And this piece appeared in Letralia magazine last year, 2020. Reclusion. I was already past the point of asking my medical friends to provide me with fake sick notes, or inventing urgent immovable trips to look after imaginary relatives. Nevertheless, one thing was certain. I was really wishing for some sudden event to remove me, even just for a few days, from the monotonous and unbearable drudgery of my job as a ministerial administrative assistant. But, more importantly, from the dictatorial head of human resources. I was thinking that a new electrical fault in the Guri reservoir would suffice, although official mourning due to the death of a useless politician was also an excellent option, perhaps even the ideal. But something as complicated and gloomy as the declaration of a pandemic never even crossed my mind. Unlike my neighbours and relatives, I stayed relatively calm when they announced, via the news and social media, that a new virus originating on the Asian continent was spreading swiftly around the globe, and that, in spite of all the strict measures of control they were imposing, it wouldn't be possible to stop its arrival and certain propagation in every country. My serenity was based on what I believed to be an irrefutable argument. If humanity, since pretty much its very beginnings, had faced up to and overcome such horribly serious and complicated situations as global wildfires, multiple plagues, meteorite landings, the danger of blowing up the planet with weapons of mass destruction, and even a Cold War, I didn't see any reason now to be disproportionately afraid of something whose name, coronavirus, actually had a nice ring to it. In that moment, it all seemed to me like some big publicity campaign announcing the arrival of a new product. But in case the danger was real, I completely trusted that some scientific progress and technology would facilitate the discovery of a cure in no time. I didn't really get agitated when they imposed the lockdown either. The sacrifice was a welcome price to pay for keeping me away from the office. On top of that, I don't have a wife or children, but I do have plenty of food and bottled water to survive, without any worry for at least 10 or 12 days. I proceeded to dust off Rayuela, Moby Dick, Lolita, and 1001 Nights. Others would wait their turn on the shelves. But one thing I was very clear about. I wouldn't only be reading during this glorious confinement. Netflix, cable TV, my varied music collection, and of course, bottles of rum, would also keep me company. I found myself feeling free, happy, motivated, like a young boy playing with the Christmas present he had always wanted. I even felt like going out on the balcony and yelling at the top of my lungs, "Long live the lockdown, damn it!" It was impossible to foresee, however, that so many consecutive days of leisure would awaken in me an appetite that was difficult to control. I started to go to the kitchen more often than any other location. It was a kind of sanctuary. The fridge seemed to demand my presence when I left its side for more than an hour. Because of this, my provisions went down at an alarming rate, and, to make matters worse, the economic situation of the country was getting even more complicated. The hostile takeover of the dollar was threatening to become much more widespread. Although they had already announced the first COVID-19 cases to appear in the city, which from that moment on turned all of us citizens into suspicious and potentially dangerous beings, I started to be more worried about the general scarcity that would inevitably come out as a direct consequence of another serious problem, the lack of petrol. Although I wasn't going to let panic get the better of me, I also wasn't going to die of hunger. So, on the 6th day, I decided to leave my quarantine and submit to the madness that was already being unleashed in the country. In spite of the restrictions imposed by the government, the streets were thronging with people who were hiding half of their face behind coloured masks. You could see that a good deal of them had been roughly handmade, using scraps of material rescued from oblivion. Some, the most fearful of course, were even wearing gloves. We all moved about at speed between one food shop and the next. Most of us were carrying large, heavy bags. People's looks and body language betrayed the anxiety of the moment. What is certain is that we all looked like extras acting in a horror film. Suddenly, the memory came to my mind of entertaining history classes at university, It was as if we'd gone back in time, specifically to the time when our hunter-gatherer ancestors went on exhausting hunting expeditions. A few dollars, painstakingly saved over years for an unlikely one-way trip to Spain, soon converted into kilos of chicken and meat, fruit, vegetables, cereals, and what's more, 1 litre of hand sanitizer, bought from a street seller for such a high price as to put the cost of more entertaining alcohols to shame. Something became apparent in these circumstances. However high the level of need and bad fortune, the level of speculation is higher. The word solidarity was abolished. It had become merely an empty construct of consonants and vowels that was useful for official speeches and crazed harangues. What I bought seemed to be sufficient to succeed in surviving a couple of weeks more, if I were to manage to control the ravenous, nervous appetite that had been unleashed in me. On getting back to my flat, I tried to follow to the letter all the advice they were repeating constantly on the television and social media to prevent contagion. Before going in, I took off my shoes and put them into a plastic bag. Then I opened the bottle of sanitizer, rubbed the liquid into my hands, and lastly opened the door. Once inside, I took the precaution of not touching the walls or the furniture. Straight away, I took off my mask and put it in the bag with my shoes. I sprayed them with alcohol and shook the bag fiercely. I washed my hands again. Although I ran the risk of completely changing their flavour, I washed the fruit and veg with soap and water. I also put the meat and chicken in boiling water. I threw the bags I'd carried the food in down the rubbish chute. My clothes went straight in the washing machine. Could I have missed something? I ended the day with a bath, in which water and soap abounded. I found that I was exhausted. From my bed, I went over in my mind everything that I had seen and heard in the street. The slow and never-ending queues outside the shops, the certain and worrying possibility of not finding what you were looking for because it had already run out, or been hoarded. And there wasn't a fixed delivery date from the suppliers. The conversations that ranged from exaggerated optimism that was barely serious, based mostly on false and selfish points of view and statements heard from politicians, to an out-of-control apocalyptic pessimism. The self-importance of doormen, police and guards that made Cerberus look like an adorable and fragile poodle. For however disagreeable and certain things seemed to me, I couldn't escape reality. Nor was it in my hands to change it. I wasn't going to achieve anything positive by complaining and blaming those responsible for a new illness. The most sensible thing to do was to adapt and survive in the best way possible. After a few minutes of fatigue and sleepiness, brought on by a couple of shots of rum and lemon, I succeeded in quietening the day's memories. From the next day, nothing was the same for me. I do admit now, with absolute honesty, that my resilience has been gradually chipped away. The only things responsible for affecting my new mental state are WhatsApp, Twitter, the news on TV, and the statements of professionals who think they know it all. Now the confinement has extended beyond the estimated period of time originally predicted, and they seem to be considering prolonging it for more weeks to come. Soon I'll have to go out again and brave the grocery stores and supermarkets. Just thinking about it makes my heart beat disproportionately faster, makes me sweat more and lose my breath. Was this what I wished for? Moreover, my desire to read lengthy tomes has rapidly vanished. I was only able to finish, and not with ease, Rauwela, the masterwork of Cortázar. Now short articles and biographies seem more attractive to me, as well as some interviews. My reacquaintance with Captain Ahab, Humbert, and Scheherazade is suspended until a future unspecified date. Neither do films or series with complicated plots or too much violence attract my attention for more than 10 or 15 minutes. I can only take in banal North American comedies from the 90s. During the nights of insomnia, when it seems that the walls and ceiling of the room threatening to flatten me, I go out to the balcony as if I'm waiting for the surprising and agreeable appearance of not necessarily a tenor or a soprano, but at least of a salsa or reggaeton singer, or of some other funny character who manages to shake up the city, which at this hour glows as if ill, as if it's peacefully resigning itself to a more and more gloomy future. However, the minutes always pass in the same way. The nighttime tedium is only disrupted by occasionally noisy sirens and intermittent blue and red lights. Perhaps the solution, in the medium term, would be to reduce the hours of isolation whilst we learn to live with this new virus, like we already do with other, more lethal ones. In spite of the optimism expressed by various philosophers, psychologists, and scientists, I believe that it's still too early to determine with any certainty the consequences, positive and negative, of this traumatic experience. It will be, without a doubt, a bit like confronting a long and complicated post-operative recovery. Then, I think, bright days will flourish, full of hope. In truth, will the HR boss seem quite so intrusive and intolerable?